Can you hear me? Okay. So I will continue with the teaching. Now we're speaking about the philosophy that is present in the Brahmana texts. And so because the Brahmanas are compiled primarily about the rituals, there's not a whole lot about them about philosophy. Now, the next point here is the development of the view of samsara. Now, this is an important point. So we're speaking about the Brahmanas. Later, we're going to speak about the Upanishads. When we talk about the Upanishads, so in that period before the Upanishads appeared, there was a really important point that people had to begin thinking about. And what that is our samsara. What in Tibetan is called korva or samsara. The thought or the view of samsara appeared at that time. And because of this, it was something that everyone had to really think about very carefully. So when you talk about samsara, so in Buddhism, we speak about samsara and nirvana. These are some of our most important terms. So in terms of the name, here it is exactly the same. But at that time, during this Vedic period, when the term samsara first appeared, it probably was not as profound as it is in our Buddhist texts. So basically, samsara basically means that you're repeating, you're going in cycles. And so this is, as I said the other day, during the time of the Rig Veda, what people thought so they didn't really think much about the topic of future lives. And even if they were to think about future lives, they would think that human ancestors had all been born in the lands of their gods. And so humans themselves thought that they would be born in the place where their ancestors were, where they'd be able to live forever, enjoying great happiness. So that is how they thought. They didn't think that there was a repeating cycle of taking many births. And that they might take births in many different types of birth. Did not appear at that such thoughts did not appear at that time. But later, when the discussion of samsara began, is the idea that instead of just taking one future life, is that even after that one would take another life. So basically, an unending series of lifetimes, or the idea that there would be an uninterrupted series of birth and death. And so this is the way that this view of samsara developed. So in brief, the samsara, this taking birth repeatedly, this uninterrupted cycle of birth and death, so later there are the Upanishads. So at that time, did Indian people in general believe in the samsara, where you had the uninterrupted cycle of birth and death? Before that time, people in general did not have the idea of there being the general idea of there being samsara and a cycle of births and lives. But when the Upanishads appeared, there was the idea of there being a samsara, where people where there was an unending cycle of births and deaths, and people began to believe it. And after this philosophy of samsara developed, and this had a great influence on all the Indian religions. No matter which religion, no matter which philosophy, they all investigated the meaning of samsara very deeply. And they felt that it was important to settle what the nature of the samsara, the cycle of birth and uninterrupted birth and death, what it is. And so for this reason, even our Buddhist literature, the samsara is an important point that we need to decisively determine. And something that we absolutely must take interest in. And so for this reason, samsara is a view that developed at that time. But when did this really deep and vast view of samsara appear? During what century did it appear? If we investigate this, and the scholars are unable to give any single answer to this because they look at many different angles of it. But in general terms, at the time of the Upanishads, during the time of the Rig Vedas, the people were mainly interested in supplicating the gods and so forth. They didn't begin to think much about what happened to people after they die or where they would go. So they didn't really think much about what the meaning of human life is. So the time of the Rig Vedas, the view of samsara, the idea of samsara had not yet appeared. And even if there were some sort of an idea or a thought about samsara, it would have been just like a seed of an idea, so that there must be something like this. It wouldn't be any decisive, or we can pretty certainly say that it wasn't any well-developed philosophy or view. Just later, at the time of the Upanishads, and I'll speak about the Upanishads later. So at the time that the Upanishads were flowing, when the Upanishads were developing, the idea of samsara was at that time was completely and fully development. So at that time, it was fully developed and it was already very widespread. So if we say, so I think we couldn't say that it appears during the times of the Upanishads. So when did the idea of samsara appear? So it probably developed initially during the time of the Brahmanas. And so I think this is probably the best hypothesis. If we say that they appeared during the time of the Upanishads, then that you couldn't say that, because at that time there was already a really very well developed philosophy of samsara and a very profound and vast explanations of it. So it was already a complete view. And so if it had been newly developed, it wouldn't have been so fully developed, right? So for that reasons, we think that if we say that they appeared at the time of the Brahmanas, then this is probably the most appropriate, most reasonable, as many scholars believe. So basically, when so in brief, the foundations of the idea of samsara come from the period of the Brahmanas. And later, during the time of the Upanishads, like the entire framework of the philosophy of samsara had developed. And so I'll speak about this in detail later. So next, what I'd like to speak about is the group of texts called the Aryanakas. Now, what these Aryanakas are is that they're another important branch of Vedic literature that are called the Aryanakas. I think you call them Aryanakas. So in Tibetan, the Gendu Triplo called them the Nakdin, or the forest texts. We could say the forest dweller texts. And so what is it said is that the Aryanakas that were made by aged Brahmins or a few people in the Kshatriya caste who, when they were went to the forest, and they wrote them while they're in the forest. And the reason why they wrote them is that when they were there's no opportunity to do an elaborate ritual of sacrifice. And you don't have the things you need to do the rituals. And so for that reason, because they didn't have what they needed in order to do many rituals, as they had a lot of time to think about philosophy. And so this is a good tradition that was then continued. It's primarily going into forests where you didn't have to busy yourself with rituals and primarily think about philosophy. And so since there is a tradition of doing this, and so for that reason, these Aryanakas, or the forest dweller texts, appeared. Now, another way it's described is that the Brahmanas were primarily described rituals that you do when you're staying at home. Now, the Aryanakas texts are for when you go to isolated places like in empty mountains or isolated forests, and if you to speak out how to do rituals and practice during that time. So that's another way of explaining it. But in brief, when you think about it, the Aryanakas are like the summary of, or the latest, or a new collection of Brahmanic literature. But in terms of the Vedic literature, they actually don't make there are very few of them, so make up a small percentage of Vedic literature. And there isn't any particular philosophical view or term that develops in them, so we do not need to speak about them much now. So now I'd like to speak about the Upanishads. Now, so first is how the Upanishads first developed. Now, as I'd mentioned before, at that time, the people of that era had given the responsibility and the roles and the importance of doing rituals to the priests who performed them. And so the priests took all the responsibility for doing the sacrifices and offerings, and so for that reason they became very powerful. And so when they would speak, they had a biased. They would only speak about their own views and their own explanations. And so when people heard these, uh, and people had to listen to these. And so what happened at that time in the Brahmanical origin is that it's like it kind of lost its life force. So it was kind of like rotting within. So previously, during the time of the Vedas, worshiping gods and feeling faith in the gods requires that you have give some importance to your mind, internal mind. But during this time, it became the external ritual that is important, the appearance of the external ritual that became important. And so, for that reason, there are some intelligent and wise people among all of the kings and the soldiers of the Kshatriya caste. And so when they looked at the way the Brahmanas did things, the way they did everything very busy, the way they did so many meaningless rituals, and how they had such a hectic time doing rituals that the people they didn't like that. They did such complicated and elaborate rituals. There's so many rituals to do, but when it came down to the actual meaning, it was kind of, they began to doubt whether these are actually beneficial or not. So people began to grow these great suspicions. Now, in terms of the way people saw things, of course, they continued to do rituals in terms of how people saw them, but in secret, they began to have many suspicions and doubts. And because of all these doubts, they began to wonder, what is the meaning of life? What is the nature of the world? What is the meaning of life? What is the essence of life? And they began to think about this. Likewise, how did the world appear? They think, who am I? How did I appear? What is going to happen to me in the future? That's just the beginning of a philosophical view. And this gradually began to develop. Then, because of this, even the proud and conceited priestess also felt to begin to think about it. They began to think that basically the way we have been doing things are they're backwards. We've gotten things wrong. And so they began to think in a new way. They kind of brainstormed a little bit, and they had different ways of thinking. And among them, some of the Brahmsis went with the members of the Kshatriyas to go study philosophy. So it's like this new tradition of thinking about philosophy, and it's like there is the seeds of like visible philosophy, and so in this way there began to be a real widespread of an Indian philosophy. It's like the seeds or like the shoot of this coming up from the earth. Now, the reason for this is that it's something that we need to think about. The most important thing that we need to think about is that we have philosophy. We can call it philosophy. In order for philosophy to come, you have to have doubts, first of all. First, you have doubts and suspicions. And these are like the seeds of philosophy, like the primary cause and condition for philosophy to develop. Because you have to think, well, who am I? You have doubts about that. The question comes, actually, who am I? We always say, me, me, me. So who's me? I need to be able to point at something and say, that's me. So who am I? We have to look for who is the real me. And in order to think about you, you have to have that question of who am I? If the question and the doubt doesn't happen, then you're not going to search for who your true self is. So philosophy, in order to do philosophy, you actually absolutely have to have doubts and suspicions. Only once you have doubts do you begin to have the intention to think that I have to actually look for the real truth. So at that time, all the Brahmas were spending every day doing all these complicated and elaborate rituals. Every day they spent all day doing rituals because they're only doing this. That the people in the Kshatriya class, so there's not any point to that. It doesn't actually have any benefit. They began to doubt that. And so once that happened, only when they were able to do that was philosophy able to develop. In particular these days when people respect things, and at the time, the people who performed the rituals at that time did not really know any philosophy. And they probably weren't able to even begin to grasp philosophy. If you think about the actual meaning of thought in the Vedas, who knew the meaning of the Vedas? It was the Brahmins didn't really know, because they were spending so much time doing the rituals. Then they spent so much time doing that they didn't actually think about the actual meaning, the actual philosophy of the Vedas. So who began to understand that? Well, it was the people in the Kshatriya class who began to understand it. And so for this, when we look at the Upanishads, the people who began to spread them were actually all members of the Kshatriya class. And so among them, there are many different people in the Kshatriya class, but the one that everyone respected the most famous king is, the most famous person at the time there's a region called Vidya, and there was a king there named Janaka. And so Janaka was the most well-known king at that time. And so under the direction of that king, the philosophy began to spread really widely. So at that time, he summoned everyone who was able to think about philosophy, and he had them all debate. They had discussions. They would discuss things and debate, and then this way he had a great influence on the spread of philosophy. And now another thing that we need to really need to understand, and so later we'll speak about the age of philosophy. And so when we speak about the age of philosophy, we need to speak about the philosophies that we always speak about, the Samkhya or Dangchenpa, the Sankhya school. And then following that, there was the Buddhist religion and the Jain religion and many others that appeared. Now, all the personages who started these, all of them were in the Kshatriya class. They were not Brahmins. They're all Kshatriyas. So another thing that we have to understand about that time is the Brahmas spent the Brahmins were the people who were supposed to do the rituals and advise people and guide people in religious affairs, but they but they didn't really understand. The Brahmins did not really understand the actual meaning of the philosophy and the meanings of the Vedas. And so for this reason, people would speak poorly about the Brahmins. Now, the next point is, when did the Upanishads develop? What is the period in which they appeared? So this time is probably from about 1,000 years BCE until about 1,000 years in the Common Era. So this is the guess that we have, the estimates that we have. So the Upanishads didn't just appear in just a few years. It took many, many months and many years for them to appear. And this is an important thing to understand. In modern times, there were many different texts that are said to be Upanishads, and if we combine them all, we'd say there are probably over 200 volumes of these texts. But the Upanishads that appeared later don't have much discussion about the nature of the world. They primarily they're compiled for the aims of religion. There is nothing particularly notable about them in terms of developing the philosophy. And in particular, some Upanishads really appeared at a very late date. Some appeared after the Muslim invasions of India, even. So what are called the Upanishads are not necessarily all actual Upanishad texts. And in particular, if we need to speak about the chronology in which the texts appeared and the dates they all appeared, we wouldn't have anything to say. But when we're speaking here about the Upanishad texts, what we're speaking about the 13 Upanishads that had been well known from ancient times. And so I think there are probably either 13 or 17 different Upanishads. So there are many different ideas. Some say 13, some say 7. So these are the early Upanishads. If we say that if otherwise, they'll just say there's many different Upanishads, as I said before, over 200 texts, over 200 volumes. Now, in terms of their content and their composition, the topics of the Upanishads is like the ancient Indian philosophy. Sorry, that's not it. The Upanishads are like the heart of ancient Indian philosophy. If you need to understand ancient Indian philosophy, you need to look at the Upanishads. However, the philosophies taught in the Upanishads are taught in fragments. It's not like a single, complete, autonomous text. Like all the text is kind of dispersed, and it's not clear what are the main texts and what are the secondary elements, because different scholars would write down their different opinions, and they'd all be compiled into one. So after this, I'd like to give you an introduction to the meaning of the word Ashinas. So the Upanishad, the Ned. So in Sanskrit, these are called the Upanishad. Upanishad. Can you say Upanishad? Upa, where it has three parts. There's a part that says Upa, Ni, and Shad. And by joining these three parts, you get the word Upanishad. And the meaning of this is that you're sitting close or sitting before some. Now, European scholar, so when you talk about this word Upanishad, the last syllabus, shad. That shad, it comes from the Proto-Indo-European word for sit. But some Indian scholars do not agree with that. In any case, to speak about it linguistically, I think that the European scholars' explanation is probably the best. And because if we look at the word shad is also appears in the word parishad. Parishad is one word. And sometimes it's used in the word parishad, also in the word samsad. But because if we look at those two words, we can see that it means to sit. And the meaning of that is that the teacher and the student would sit facing each other, near to each other. And the reason for this is, or the aim of doing that, is that when giving the spiritual instructions, the pith instructions of the philosophy, other people must not know about that. In order that other people did not learn the profound meaning of the philosophical text, the student would sit close to the teacher. And so for that reason, it's called the meaning is to sitting close by. And so that is where the meaning comes from. So generally, the Upanishads were taught secretly and in private. And this tradition, the tradition of doing so can be, that there was this tradition can be known from many different factors. For example, it said that if the teacher and the student didn't live in the same place, then the teacher would not give the student the instructions. And if if you were not the eldest son of the teacher, you didn't reason. If you did not keep vows purely, they would give the instruction. And even if you were a student, the student had to be peaceful and dispelled. If you weren't a superior student, then you would not be given the instructions on philosophy. And so for this reason, among the different names for the words, the Upanishads, there are the words rahasya, which means secret. There's guhya adesaha. So guhya adesaha means like secret pith instructions. Also, the paramam guhya means like the supreme secret. And so there are many different names of the Upanishads, and they're all related to secrecy. Well, the situation is to be secret and hidden, because at that time, when the gurus were giving the disciples the pith instructions on the philosophy, they would give it in secret so that other people would not know, because ordinary people were not allowed to know this. Know the meaning of the philosophy is only for superior students. Philosophy is really very complicated. Now, when we speak about the topic of philosophy, as I said before, the primary topic of the Upanishads is philosophy. And at that time, many people, it's like people, so speaking about the ultimate nature and the true wisdom that people of that time had discovered. So in this time, when we speak about philosophy, we can divide it into two main topics. And it's easier if we explained it in any of these terms. And the first is like the philosophy of the nature of the world, like the idea about the nature or the essence of the world, and then the philosophy of the final result. So these are the two aspects. Now, the first I'm going to speak about the philosophy of the nature of the world. When you talk about the philosophy of the nature of the world or universal spiritual law, this is like the essence of the content of all of the Upanishads. It's like the basis of the philosophy. And so this is also, when we think about what it said in the Upanishads, it said that all phenomena, it says that, I'm talking about the relation between the God and all phenomena, saying that there's a relationship between all phenomena and God or Brahma, that phenomena radiate out from and dissolve back into Brahma. So when we talk about God at this point, it's not talking about gods and humans. When we talk about Brahma, when we say Brahma, and we think of Brahma as an individual, and I think that they probably didn't consider it this. Basically, Brahma is like the name, giving the name Brahma to the ultimate nature, the way things are. I don't think they understood it as being a god or an individual. It's giving the name Brahma to the nature of things, and because everything arises out of that nature or the dharmata, then because of that reason, then there is a relationship between all phenomena and Brahma of radiating out from and dissolving back into him. So what they're saying is that all phenomena are Brahma. Or you can say that everything arises from the expanse of Brahma. It's like we're saying, basically arising from the expanse of the basic nature. And so you've got the dharmata, the basic nature, is basically like the foundation. Everything arises from that expanse. And what they thought at that time is that everything we see now and everything we hear with our ears and everything we can smell, everything that is and that's basically everything we can, how can all the world that we can experience with our senses, how did it arise? And when they were thinking about this, they had this thought that all of these various different brilliant phenomena we see had to come from a single source, and that source they gave the name Brahma. So Brahma was a god whom they previously thought was very important. So later that god later they saw him not as an individual god, a god with a specific form, a specific body, but instead they promoted him to being like the nature of everything and called them Brahma. So basically they said everything arose from this god or from this basic nature. And in the end, all of the phenomena of the world they're going to dissolve back and end in them. So the whole world is going to, they arose from this source, and they, in the end, they're going to perish within it. Now, if we think about this, actually, it's actually a very high level of thinking. For instance, think about people say. People talk about the Big Bang Theory, right? The scientists speak about the Big Bang Theory as the huge explosion at the beginning of the universe, and gradually the universe developed, right? But if you look at the view of the philosophers is even deeper than that. Even before matter appeared, how are they thinking even more deeply and more profoundly than that? So Brahma is not the nature of matter, but instead he's beyond that. They think that his nature is cognition or awareness. And so for this reason, what they would say is that Brahma is like the nature of this. And so it's like he's by nature, he's awareness. He's not a material. The essence of Brahma is awareness, and his form is like light. Now, everything that is in the sphere is everything that is the actual nature, because if we think about it from his own perspective, he basically only knows the actual nature. He does not know or does not consider anything other than the actual nature. Likewise, the nature of Brahma is empty. And because he's empty, he permeates all things. And because he's empty, then he's unobstructable. Because his emptiness, he's unobstructive, and because he's unobstructive, he can pervade all phenomena. And so what this is actually talking about is actually something that is beyond our conception. When they also think about the nature of the dog, of the self, in order to think about the nature of Brahma, first you have to think about the self. And what is the self? When I say me, and we need to first turn ourselves, instead of looking outside doesn't help. We need to turn our attention inward and search for who is me. We need to look, who is me? We need to know who is me. What am I? And when you look at it, it says that in the end, when you look for that, in the end, you're just Brahman. Because when you find the nature of yourself, you find Brahma, is what they're saying. That's the basic point. The nature of all phenomena is Brahman. It arises from Brahman. So when you look for the source of any phenomena, then you find Brahma. So if you look for the nature of the self, then in the end, where do you find it? You find it in the basic nature. And what is that basic nature? It is Brahma. And so what is Brahma? If you look at it on a small level, it's even smaller than a grain of rice, extremely pure. It's extremely tiny from the level of that. If you think about it in terms of space, it is the large side is greater than a universe, vaster than the sky. So basically, everything from this, the nature of everything small is a grain, and all the things that are as large as the universe are all Brahma. This is what they're saying. And so I'm about to become a non-Buddha, about to become a Hindu if I'm not careful. And so this is what they say. So there's a Japanese scholar. It's probably from the 18th or 19th century. This is that in Japan, so in Japan, the study of Sanskrit began at Tokyo University. And they began studying the study of Indology and Sanskrit. And he was the one who started it. And so his name was Takakusu Junjiro. Takakusu Junjiro. Takakusu Junjiro says, if you think about the philosophy, the nature of how things are, we can divide it into two aspects: how things are and how things appear. When you divide it into these two parts of how things are and how they appear, so ask, well, first, what is the nature of how things are? This view of how things are is that the people of that time were wondering, what is the nature of all things? What is the basis of the nature of all things? And they searched for it. What is the source or foundation of all phenomena? What is the origin of all things? They began investigating this and looking for this. They were researching this. And when they were investing this, they went outside. And if you go out and look outside, there's nowhere to look for them. So where you have to begin your investigation is with the Atman in Sanskrit. The Atman means the self. It begins from the self or me. It's not for looking out. It's not looking out. Instead, it's looking in. Thinking instead about yourself inside and think, well, what am I? Who am I? That's where you need to start your investigation. Instead of think, oh, what's this pillar? What is this this jug? If you think about it, there's no end to it. Because there's no end to the things like vases and pillars. And so there's nowhere you can look for everything there. So if you want to look instead, you need to turn your attention inwards towards yourself and wonder, who am I? You need to ask yourself this question. Who am I? What am I like? You need to think about this. That's where you begin. And if you're thinking about what is my nature, who am I, what am I, this is primarily taught. This is the primary talk about the heart of the essence of the Upanishads. What is the me or the self? Now, basically, there are many complicated philosophies in the Upanishads, similar like we have in Buddhism, where you have many complicated discussions and unending discussions. But in the fundamental in the Upanishads is looking what is the nature of me? What is the nature of the self? It is thinking what is the nature of what is my nature and searching for it. Then when we're looking for that, if we are able to really look for that nature of the self, then in that way, by looking through that, then in order to find that, we need to look for the nature of all phenomena. So before we look at the nature of all phenomena, first we have to understand what is the nature of the self or the me. That's like the foundation. And because of that, the Atma or the self is discussed frequently. So we Buddhists say that, and we call this a view of the self, right? We say that the non-Buddhist Hindus have the view of the self. So when it's easy, but when you say this is a view of the self, we say, that they're a view of the self, and then just leave it there at that. So is this something that they're just saying, and if we leave it there, then that's not okay. We need to actually look at how are they viewing the self? We need to look at what is the self that they're looking at. We have to look at what is that self? In the end, when you're looking at the nation, what is the self that they find? Do they find a self that looks at essence? We have to look and see what do they actually say about that. If we just say the non-Buddhists believe in a self, then we leave it at that. That doesn't work. So that is the view of then how things are. Now we look at the view of how things appear. Now, when you talk about the view of how things appear, somebody's saying all the things that people see with their eyes or hear with their ears, they hear that we smell with our nose, the things that we feel through touch with the body. If we think about it in a corso, we think about the things that are the objects of our senses, are the things that we can see, hear, and know in this external world. Now, how did they arise? This is something we need to think about. So why? Why are there the appearances of the world? Why do we experience suffering? Why do we experience how to experience happiness? How did all these various appearances happen? And so thinking about it is called the view of how things appear. And so if we think about this in terms of the Upanishads, there are essentially three different explanations in the Upanishads. Of course, there are many different explanations, but they're primarily three. And the first of these is the saying that they are mind. And what this is saying is that all of these appearances, now this is one, this is the first tradition. It's saying that where did all these appearances come from? They said that it comes from Brahma. As I said, we were talking Brahma. Brahma is like the basic nature, not the God Brahma here. So Brahma is like to be a universal or a principal mind, a primal mind. So mind is like a cosmic mind, a huge mind. It's a cosmic mind that pervades everything, and everything has to come from it, right? And so in order to come from it, it has to be a huge mind. And because you have the great mind, if you have this all-pervasive mind, and within that expanse of that, all phenomena arise, they say. This explanation, and the explanations in our Buddhist texts, in the Avatamsaka Sutra and in the Mahamana Sutra, are similar to the idea that all phenomena are manifestations of mind, or that they are mind by nature. They're very similar. But the main point here is that saying that everything is a manifestation of the mind. And what is the mind? Mind is like the basic nature, the primal nature, the basic of the mind. And that is going to be called the mind or Brahma. And so it is nature by Brahma. As I said before, Brahma is by nature, his awareness by nature. The essence of Brahma is the clear awareness that, by nature, the luminous awareness by nature that pervades all phenomena. And so this is all pervasive cosmic mind, and everything arises from within that expanse. And there's a really important thing to understand here. As the scientists will talk about the Big Bang theory, and said everything arises from that. Now, before the Big Bang, if you speak about quantum physics, when they look at smaller and smaller particles, and even the smallest particles cannot be and they can be said to become like the awareness, conscious by awareness is going to become similar to that in quantum physics. And so I think that there's something to understand here. That's the first view, the idea that all phenomena are mind. And the second is the all-pervasive God. Now, when you talk about the all-pervasive God, what we mean is that Brahma, that basic primal nature, is divided into two aspects. So you can talk about two aspects. Conceptually, it's in two aspects. One essence with two concepts. So you have to divide it into the actual nature and the actual appearance. So the actual nature is real. It's what it really is. That's the actual nature of how things are. And the appearance is just as the mere external appearance. And so that is how they describe it. So when you talk about the relation of the actual nature and the appearance, it's like the relation between water and waves, because water and waves are the same, but they're just conceptually different. It's because all of the appearances arise from the expanse of the nature, and they are not separate from it in essence. And so for that reason, in the Upanishad, it says that everything is Brahma. So that is that should be understood in this way, because all phenomena arise from the expanse of this basic nature, and they're not separate from this. So for that reason, we say that everything is Brahma. So this explanation is similar to what we call the philosophy of Buddha nature, or the Buddha nature school, or the Shentong school, but I'm not going to explain that in detail right now. Now later, the third view, which is saying that all phenomena are specific characteristics or actually existing. When they're saying that all phenomena are emanations of phenomena or arose from Brahma. And so that Brahma is like the creator, the controller of everything, underneath everything. However, each phenomena has its own characteristics or its own particular mode of existence, its own existence, its own situation. So what this is saying is that at the beginning, all phenomena were made by Brahma or arose from the expanse of Brahma. And after they had arisen, then Brahma and the phenomena became distinguished. There's a difference to the development. They became different in terms of their characteristics, and their features became different. And so I think it's basically saying that the perceiver and the perceived are separate in nature. Like you've got this perceiver and the perceived are different natures. The Brahma, the nature of Brahma, the nature of all phenomena is different, is what they're saying. Similarly, there's also an Upanishad called the Svetasvatara. So there's an Upanishad called the Svetasvatara. So there are many of different Ushamans, and one of these is the Svetasvatara. And what it says in that one says that Brahma has ignorance from beginningless time. Brahma is divided into the awareness and unawareness, or knowledge and ignorance. Because Brahma has ignorance, and by the power and all phenomena arose out of the ignorance of Brahmas. This is what it said. So it does say this in this Upanishad. And if we look at this, we would say that the Brahma also has the aware and the unaware times. And when he's moved by the ignorance, then because all the appearances of the varied universe occur. And so this this explanation is very similar to the explanation of the teachings on the Buddha nature or the Shentong views, where it says that things are covered with adventitious seeds. The Dharmata itself the Buddha nature itself is free of any sames, but is covered by adventitious scenes. So in its nature, it is unstained, but it is in its appearance, it is covered by the adventitious means. And so this is similar. Now, the reason where this comes from is that you have one cause. When you say that if all phenomena arise from one cause, then it's difficult to say what is that one cause. Everything arises from one origin, you say, from one dharmata or one origin. It's very, very difficult in terms of philosophically. There are many different questions and doubts and suspicions that come from that. And so for that reason, they describe it into the difference between ignorance and knowledge. And that's one way of giving an answer or avoiding that difficulty. And so there are many such logics that develop. And so that is so there are many of these different philosophies that appeared, but primarily, as I described before, is the view of the nature of the world, or the view of how things are. And then the next we spoke about so I spoke about so I'll speak about so now tomorrow's the day off. So the day after tomorrow, I'll speak about how things arose. So as I have been explaining, what we can know from all this is that at that time, even in very ancient times in India, there had been a great increase in the intelligence of the people. And they were able to come to an extremely high level of philosophy. And because their level of philosophical thinking had become to such a high level that they end up actually very similar to many later Buddhist thoughts. And the reason is because the people of that time had come to such a high level of thinking that later that they became similar to the later Buddhist philosophies. In particular, at that time, the level of people's thinking had such a high level of thinking and because of that, the Buddhist teachings were able to appear, to flourish. The Buddha himself was an incredibly intelligent person, and at that time, he was born in India. And he wanted to, and the fact that he was able to introduce all these experiences that he had within his own mind, because it was because of the high level of thinking that people had achieved a high level of thinking because of Indian philosophy. And so when the Buddha was able to and so for that reason, the Buddha was able to teach the dharmas that he had experienced in his mind. If it were different, if the people had not come to such a high level of thinking and philosophy, then the Buddha it would have been difficult for the Buddha to even dare to begin teaching. If people had not come to such a high level of thinking, and if they were, and if they had stayed on a sort of level of a polytheistic way of thinking about things, and the Buddha would say that there's no creator of the world, and that everything is interdependent, then there would have been a danger even for the Buddha's body. People would say he's saying such horrid things, even that there's no God. So there'd be the danger that people would bring sticks and beat him. But in the environment that the Buddha was born in, there are so many people who are intelligent and learned that there's already been a firm ground of philosophy that had been established. And so when the Buddha gave his teachings, there was something that people could get their minds around. And the Buddha's teachings were able to flourish. So the reason for this is because of the vast and profound philosophies that had already developed in India. Now, another thing we need to understand clearly is that when the Buddha first appeared in the world, there were no Buddhist teachings at that time. Now, these days, it's like the Buddha's teachings are vast and profound. And there's a fair number of people who believe in them. When the Buddha appeared in the world, the Buddha just beginning to spread his teachings. At the beginning, there were no followers of the Buddha. He started from zero, from nothing. And we started from nothing, and he had to speak. It's not easy. But the Buddha's But the Buddha was so superior and greater than anyone else in terms of his intelligence and in terms of his conduct, behavior, in any respect, that even the people of that time who were already at a very high level in terms of their thinking and philosophy recognized him as a great being, as a great master. They accepted him as a great being. And because they were able to accept him as a great person, we can really see that, yes, he really was a superior person. Because at that time, the level of philosophy in India, and there are so many different philosophies in India at that time, and he even appearing at that time, the Buddha had to have such a great great influence and to be able to move so many people. And it's not just people of one caste. There are Brahmins, there are Kshatriyas, there are Vaishyas, there are all people of all the different castes. And so in terms of all the different peoples and in terms of people of all different levels of education and people of all different economic levels, he was able to move them all. He was able to inspire faith in all of them. And this shows that the Buddha is a different person. And what he said was really fit how things actually are. And that in the actual way is actually really beneficial in the way things are. And this is why people started to like him and started to support him. And so this is something we need to clearly understand. Similarly, another thing we need to think about is, as I said before, when we always talk about the non-Buddhists, we think as people have no view, think that has no knowledge of anything. But in the actual way things are, when we think about the non-Buddhist Samkhya, the people who started the rishis or the sages or the Brahmins or Kshatriyas who composed them, they were all extremely learned people. Perhaps if we think about, if the Buddhists, from one person, from Buddhists, perhaps it's superstition, perhaps it's natural, maybe they were bodhisattvas. We can't know who they were. But anyways, their philosophies are all extremely profound. And like our Buddha the Buddha's philosophy, the Samkhya was earlier, right? And so you think about the earlier ancient Indian philosophies, the individuals who spread these philosophies are just not ordinary individuals. Otherwise, we call them extremists and non-Buddhists, and we think that they have no value. And from one way of looking at it, this is actually a great mistake on our own part. This is something that we need to study. And I think that it prevents us from learning a lot. It prevents many opportunities. If we need to actually study the way they think and the way they think, and that we need to study their philosophy. If we are able to understand more about them, then I think we'll be able to only then really appreciate how the Buddhism developed, and and see that the Buddhism appeared on a vast, great foundation. It wasn't something that just someone thought up and made and thought up. It had thousands or hundreds of years of history and philosophy as a basis. That's how Buddhism developed. It's not like the people today have so many things and just make something up today. It's not like that now. And so in order to understand the background history of all this, we need to, there's no choice but to speak about the philosophical texts of ancient India. There's no choice but to really investigate the non-Buddhist texts. So I think I can speak about more of those later. I don't need to say too much right now. So maybe tomorrow's the day after, and then the day after I will continue. So when we begin the topic of the Vedic period, and then we can speak about how the Buddhist teachings originated and how they spread, right? Now, actually, I'm a little bit apprehensive about saying that, because actually I've got 2 weeks I've primarily been speaking about the Vedas. So many of you might be thinking and saying, how's he ever going to get to mantra? He's not going to speak about mantra. He's only going to speak only about the non-Buddhist schools, right? And I sometimes, so I thought if I can get to the Buddhist and because if I can get to them, then I could actually say that it's actually meaningful for it to have advertised as a teaching of the origins of mantra. From my own perspective, I could say, no hurry to say everything. If I had to speak a month, I could say that there's no end to things to say. I could teach for a month. I could teach for 2 months. But the main topic that we're speaking about now is related to the Buddhist mantra. And so before we speak about Buddhist mantra, first we need to speak about how the Buddha appeared. We need to think about how the teachings flourished, and then only then can we speak about the mantra, the appearance of the mantra. So I don't have so I have a little bit of worry about that, but I think it's probably not a difficulty. So we will now recite the dedication prayers.
So like